We'll also want to think about clinical data when becoming compliant with the mandate. So let's discuss some data mapping and potential quality issues related specifically to clinical data. First, Lax, could you tell us a little bit about the scope of the clinical data types that are covered under the mandate?
Sure. So clinical data is critical. So the way the mandate looks at this is US CDI, which is core US core data interoperability data classes. That's how they qualify this clinical data. There are about 27 different types of clinical data that are in scope for this mandate. And the way these clinical data are represented are more in terms of the logical definitions are available in the USCDI format. So eventually, from a patient access API perspective, the mandate looks at this 27 different types of clinical data to be mapped to the target US core fire profiles. Now, as this mapping is also applicable for payer-to-payer data exchange, it's important that we understand the mapping between the source system to this USCDI format.
So we've seen that these types of clinical data that you mentioned are often in images or PDF files. How should payers handle data that's in these formats?
Sure. There are a few suggestions from a practitioner perspective as well as from a CMS guidance perspective. Is that if a payer has these clinical data elements uh, in the structured data format, then they need to make the data available. But if it is available in a big blob or an image or a big PDF, then mining these PDFs is a challenge in terms of extracting that data out of that PDF documents. So the scope primarily is going to focus more towards payer who are having clinical data in a structured format would need to be scoped first. Subsequently, if the clinical data is available in a PDF or an image file, then these could be considered for out of scope for this mandate.
Thanks for clarifying that distinction. So now that we kind of understand the scope of clinical data that's covered under the mandate, Brian, can you tell us a little bit more about what data within a QNext system might the mandate apply to specifically?
Sure. From a perspective of the clinical data, QNext will house some of that traditionally in the claims information. So claims detail tables, things like that will have diagnosis and procedure codes. If you have incoming pharmacy claims that are getting loaded into QNext, you'll be able to get to things like medications, potentially those sorts of things. When you start getting into some of the other areas, it'll get a little more complicated. But most of this data can be found on claims submitted for specific members.
And what about more specific clinical data like vital statistics and lab results?
Yeah, if you start getting to areas like blood pressure readings, lab results, typically those come from EMRs or perhaps the care management systems, depending on how effective the tie-ins between those systems and QNext are, or those systems and the other systems in play are in this case. Clinical notes will typically end up in care management systems such as Care Advance or Altruista, but if a plan doesn't use specific care management systems, this data may be harder to get at if it's available at all.
That makes sense. So now understanding kind of the scope of the data, Brian, what are some of the quality issues to consider in regards to the clinical data?
From a clinical data perspective, the primary quality issue that I think you'll see is the inconsistency of in which the data may be available. There may be one member, for example, that has all their lab results and other data available simply because their providers have more effective systems for tracking and sharing this data, or they submit it differently. Other members may have less information available, and of course, the payer can only provide what is known to them. Unpaid claims, the possibility of getting inaccurate clinical data like diagnosis codes or procedure codes, that's less likely because there are controls in place to make sure that those codes are accurate before those claims are paid.
These are all great considerations. Thank you. So we've talked about the data mapping and quality issues related to clinical data that's covered under the scope of the mandate. Lax, could you give us a few takeaways for payers as they begin to make their clinical data compliant under the mandate?
Sure. So, so as we see, Brian did talk about some nuances in terms of how the clinical data depends on the provider systems. From a roadmap perspective, what we think is this clinical data adoption from payers' perspective or exposing the clinical data to through FHIR will be a progressive exercise. First, the payers would focus on the structured clinical data or the clinical data which are in a more structured format which they have obtained, which they have got it from the providers. They would make that available as FHIR as FHIR resources. Subsequent to that, they will expand on the different type of clinical data that are available from one or many systems. So we see this happening that any clinical data that are closer to the core claims administration system would be available in the first pass. Subsequently, they're going to look at the care coordination system or the care management system, and look at the clinical data in those systems and try to expose those as well.